now starting Perek Yud Beis, and this is the aftermath of Yiftach's great victory over the Bnei Ammon, and the tragedy of Yiftach's daughter, who was either killed or at least forced to live in seclusion as a hermit, never marrying, never having company except for 4 days a year. And now we have another incident. Vayitzak ish Ephraim, v'yavor tzafona. The tribe of Ephraim was very upset with Yiftach, and they went north to Mitzpah, where Yiftach was. Vayomru leYiftach, and they said to Yiftach, a very interesting complaint, Madua avarte lilachem b'fnei Ammon, you organize an army to fight against the Ammonites. V'lanu lo karasu l'achas, you didn't ask us to join you. It's very interesting. So many people are looking to get out of military service, but here the Bnei Ephraim are complaining. Why did you not invite us to participate in this milchama? And we're so unhappy with you. Beischa nisraf, we will destroy your house. Alecha b'yesh. Again, I mean, you see kind of the hefkeris here. They're just saying, we don't like your decision, we're going to destroy your house. Ish kol hayasher b'yenav. Now, let me just remind you, a few chapters ago, we had an identical complaint against an earlier shofet, Gidon. And if you remember, Gidon actually complimented the Bnei Ephraim by saying, you're better than me, you're more heroic than me. Chas v'shalom, the fact that I didn't ask you to fight initially was not because you were not worthy. And Gidon actually took away the anger. As Shlomo HaMelech says, Ma nerach, a soft answer, Yoshiv Chema, takes away fury. Now here you have the identical argument that the Bnei Ephraim are saying. Apparently they get very upset when they're not asked to participate in war. Why didn't you ask us? And Yiftach here is not as diplomatic as Gidon. Yiftach responds in the same way that they're talking to him. Fire for fire. Vayomer Yiftach aleim, and Yiftach says to them, Ish riv hayisi ani v'yami uvnei Ammon ma'od. I was fighting against the Ammonites for a very long time. V'ezak eschem, and in the past I asked you to come. V'lo hoshatim osim, you didn't do anything. Meaning, I didn't ask you because you don't help out. You're not very helpful. You didn't do it in the past. In other words, instead of building them up, he's putting them down. I see that you're good for nothing. You don't save anybody. And I put my own life in my hands to fight. I crossed the Jordan to fight against the Ammonites. And God gave me victory. Why are you fighting against me? You guys are worthless. That's why I didn't ask you. It's not the best thing to say when someone is angry at you. And as a result, this is a tragic footnote. Actually, not a footnote, it's in the text. That there was a war between Yiftach's army and the Bnei Ephraim. A war of Jew against Jew. Vayikbots Yiftach has called Anshe Gilad. Yiftach gathered together all the people of Gilad from east of the Yardane. Vayilachem es Ephraim, and they fought Ephraim. Vayaku Anshe Gilad es Ephraim, and the Anshe Gilad defeated the Bnei Ephraim. Ki Amru, they said, Peleite Ephraim atem Gilad betoch Ephraim betoch Menashe. So again, this is an obscure pasuk, but the way Rashi explains it, apparently many of the people of Gilad actually moved to the territory of Ephraim and Menashe, west of the Yardane, for Parnasa or the like, and they were treated as inferiors. They were called Pleitei Ephraim, the refuse of Ephraim. In other words, the Giladim who came to Ephraim were called the refuse, the garbage of Ephraim. So at this point, the Giladi are now taking their revenge against the Bnei Ephraim that called them Pleitei Ephraim, the refuse of Ephraim. And the pasuk says, so now this is a war of the Anshe Gilad against the Bnei Ephraim. Vayilkot Gilad, Es Mabros Hayardane Ephraim. Gilad, from the east, had taken control of all of the Yardane crossings, because apparently Bnei Ephraim would often cross the Yardane, and these crossings, whether they're bridges or footpaths where the water level is low, were all controlled by the Giladim. V'haya ki yaimru pleitei Ephraim evayra. So whenever somebody from Ephraim's territory would want to cross the Yardane, they'd have to pass a border check. Vayaimru lo anshe Gilad. The anshe Gilad would say to the person who wants to cross the river, it's like a toll booth, Ha Ephrasi ata. Are you from the tribe of Ephraim? Vayomer lo. Of course, the person would say no, because Ephraim would be killed. Vayomru lo. So the Anshe Gilad gave a test. Emor na shiboles. Say the word shiboles. Shiboles. Shiboles literally means a stream of water. But Bnei Ephraim were like Litvaks. They had difficulty pronouncing shin. So they could not say the word shiboles. They would say it siboles. And if they could not pronounce it, if they would say siboles, they were Ephraimites, and they would be killed. Right? This was the code word. Say the word shiboles. Vayomer, and if the person was an Ephraim person, he would say siboles. V'lo yochin l'daber kain. They could not speak properly. And then what would happen is, vayochazu oso. The Bnei Gilad would grab this Ephraim person, vayishchatua, they would slaughter him, el ma'abros hayardane, by the crossings of the Jordan River. And look at this number, phenomenal, heartbreaking. Vayipael bo'ei sahim Ephraim, arboim ushnayim aleph. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed by the Giladim. To me, it's always amazing how this is just passed over in just one pasuk. But this number is a tremendously large number. And what makes the tragedy even worse is it was inflicted not by the enemy, but by Jew against Jew. Be it as it may, we then finish up with Yiftach. Vayishpot Yiftach es Yisrael sheish shanim. Yiftach's whole term as a shofet was only 6 years. Vayamas Yiftach hagiladi, and Yiftach died. And the pasuk says, Vayikaver bi'arei Gilad, and he was buried in the cities of Gilad. Now Chazal point out this is a little strange. In the cities of Gilad implies he was buried in several places. And according to some Meforshim, as part of an einish for all that he did, his body was disintegrated or cut up, and different parts were buried in different places, which obviously is totally keneged halacha as well. So mitchila v'yat seif, there's all sorts of things that are not so good here. So what happened after Yiftach? So the pasuk says, "Vayishbait acharav es Yisrael, iftsan mi beis lachem." So after Yiftach came a shofet who was called Iftsan, and Iftsan was from the town of Beis Lechem. Beis Lechem is the same place where it is today. That's where Kever Rachel, and this is in the Chelek of Yehuda. So Iftsan comes from the tribe of Yehuda, and similar to an earlier shofet, we are told, Vayihi lo shloshim banim ushloshim banot. He had 30 sons and 30 daughters, 60 children. Shilach achutza, the banot were sent out of the home to get married. Ushloshim banot hevi lebanav min achutz, and 30 women were brought to marry his sons within Beis Lechem. Vayishbot es Yisrael sheva shanim. He was a shofet for 7 years. Vayamas Iftsan, and Iftsan died. Vayikaver bebeit Lechem, and he was buried in Beis Lechem. So very little is told about Iftzan, but here there's something very, very important that Chazal tell us. Chazal tell us that this Shofet of Iftzan, who only ruled for 7 years from Beis Lechem, is none other than Boaz, the main character with Rus, in Megillas Rus. And in fact, Boaz is a descendant of Nachshon ben Aminadav, the great Nasi of the tribe of Yehuda, who was the first to jump into the Yam Suf up to his neck or up to his nose. And in the Zechus of his Emunah, the water split. And Boaz indeed had so many children, he had 60 sons and 60 daughters. But it is said that all of them died. He was a widower, and all of them died when Rus, the Moabite woman, showed up. And Boaz was towards the end of his life. And it seemed to Boaz that everything was gone. And we know from the story of Rus that he married Rus, the Moabite, because although you're not allowed to marry a Moabite, that only applies to the men and not to the women. And Boaz was with Rus exactly one night. He died the next morning. But in that one night, he impregnated Rus, and Rus had a child called Oved, and Oved grew up and had a child, Yishai, and Yishai had a number of sons, but he had David HaMelech, and from David the Mashiach will come. And people think, oh, Boaz died because he committed the sin of being with the Moabite. But no, there was no sin. It's exactly the opposite. He should have died earlier. Hashem kept him alive so he would have that one night with Rus to plant the seed of Mashiach that comes from Boaz, Shevet Yehuda, Nachshon ben Aminadav going back, David HaMelech going forward. Boaz and Rus are the links in that chain, and that is none other than Iftzan. So although Iftzan is not really discussed that much in the book of Shoftim, but the whole book of Rus is about this Shofet Iftzan, who is Boaz. So Boaz was only a Shofet for 7 years. Vayishbod Acharav es Yisrael. After him was another Shofet, Elon Hazvuloni, Elon from the tribe of Zavulon. Vayishbod es Yisrael, Eser Shanim, 10 years again. As I said before, no news is good news. When we're not told anything, any event, that means everything was b'shalom, both in Ruchnius and Gashmias. Vayamas Elon Hazvuloni, Elon from the tribe of Zavulon died. V'yikaver ba'Ayalon, b'Yeretz Zavulon. He was buried in Ayalon, in the territory of Zavulon. Vayishbod Acharav es Yisrael, Avdun ben Hillel HaPirosoni. The judge after Elon was Avdon, the son of Hillel from Parason. Again, this is I believe it's the only place in Tanakh where where Hillel is a name, and this is brought down la halacha. There's a machlokas in a get, for example. Do you spell Hillel with a yud or without a yud? And many poskim bring a raya that Hillel in Tanakh is without a yud, and that's how we commonly spell it today. Vayilo, and once again it mentions he had 40 sons, and Shloshim b'nei banim, and 30 grandsons. Now that sounds a little odd. If you have 40 sons, you'd expect to have more than that number of grandchildren. But at least in his lifetime, he had 30 grandchildren. And together, Rochvim al Shivim Ayarim, they became men of distinction, Chashivas, who were riding on these 70 special donkeys. Vayishbod es Yisrael Shemaina Shanim, and he was a Shofet for 8 years. Again, no events are recorded, so these were good years. Vayamas Avdon ben Hillel HaParasani. Avdon ben Hillel from Parason died. Vayikaver b'Parason. He was buried in the city of Parason, which was in the tribe of Ephraim, Bahara Maleki, in the mountains that had previously been occupied by the Amalekites. And these were a good period. Once again, we're going to read about a good period followed by a bad period, and that will lead to the stories of Shimshon, again one of the most interesting of the judges. Kol Tov, Shalom.